Hello and welcome to the RealTime Fantasy Sports Show. I'm Jeff Paur, senior writer with RealTime Fantasy Sports, and it is time for start, sits, and sleepers for Week 13 of the NFL season. First of all, happy Thanksgiving to everybody out there. Hope you have a great day. Remember, there's 3 games on Thanksgiving. We have one on Black Friday as well, so just be prepared with these fantasy lineups, but I hope you have a great Thanksgiving. I know it's my favorite holiday of the year. Love the food, love the football. Doesn't get much better than that. I hope you have a great time with all of your family and friends this Thanksgiving. So last week on Start, Sits, and Sleepers, I went 14-12. Not a bad week. I'm up to 55% correct on the season with my picks. I'm 172 and 140. Hopefully I can get going to do a little better the rest of the way, help you out. But we're having fun this year, and I hope you're having a lot of success with your teams. We just have a couple weeks left, so it's crunch time. These are big games this week, so you're probably going to be sitting around the Thanksgiving table wondering about what's happening with your fantasy players. Hopefully they have some big games on the big day. Let's start with the starts. So we're going to give you 3 starts, 3 sits, and a sleeper at quarterback, running back, and receiver. And then at tight end, I'll give you 2 starts, 2 sits, and a sleeper. The starts. We'll start with QB. My first start is Bo Nix. He hasn't been nearly as consistent as you would like this year, kind of been all over the place. He has 2 straight games with fewer than 16 fantasy points, but he does have 20-plus points, 6 of 11 games this year, capable of a huge game any week in this offense. He plays Washington this week. I think this is a get-right game for him. They allow the 6th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. Commanders have given up 300-plus passing yards 2 of their last 3 games as well. I like Nix to do well in Week 13. My next start at QB is Jacoby Brissett of the Arizona Cardinals. Never thought I'd be saying this, but he's been absolutely fantastic since being inserted as a starter for Arizona. He is 3rd in quarterback score in his last 3 games. He has 21-plus fantasy points all 6 of his games this year. He gets a Bucs. They allow the 4th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. They're all sorts of beat up offensively and defensively with injuries. I think Brissett keeps it going, has another big game, and I'd feel good about him as my starting quarterback this week. My last start at QB is Joe Burrow of the Cincinnati Bengals. I know most of you are going to be saying, hey, if Burrow's starting, you're going to start him. You're right for the most part, but I think some people are a little worried about the long layoff. He's been out with that foot injury. He's back, though, and he's capable of the monster game any given week. I know he hasn't played great to start the year before he got hurt, but I think he gets it going this week against Baltimore. It's a short week. I feel like a lot of times with these short week games, when these teams don't have a lot of time to prepare it, they're more high scoring. So I think this is going to be a high scoring game with the Ravens. They're playing a little better defensively, but they're still middle of the pack against the pass. I think the Bengals are going to have success throwing the ball here, and I'd feel good about starting Burrow. Jamar Chase is there. I know T. Higgins is out, but as long as Chase is around, he can produce big numbers in this offense. All right, let's move on to the sits at QB. My first sit is Daniel Jones of the Indianapolis Colts. He continues to have his best season as a pro. He's looked really good. He's been pretty fantastic all season long. He had 20-plus fantasy points 5 straight games before last week, but last week he was held to fewer than 200 passing yards, and he scored just 18.7 fantasy points against that good Chiefs secondary. He gets another tough matchup this week against a good Texans defense. Houston, they allow the fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. Texans have not given up more than 200 passing yards since week 3. I think Jones is a bit of a scary play in this matchup. I would go with other options if you have them. My next sit at quarterback is Jared Goff of the Detroit Lions. He's been a little more inconsistent this year, less than 20 points, 6 of 11 games. So he hasn't really been that surefire fantasy thing every week. Now he plays the Packers this week on that Thanksgiving Day game. They allow the 5th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. They allowed just 52 passing yards last week, less than 200 passing yards allowed 4 straight games as well. I think if the Lions are going to have success, it's going to be more so on the ground than through the air. I think Goff could be kind of ho-hum once again in Week 13. My last sit at QB is Aaron Rodgers of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He has that wrist injury, but it looks like he's going to play this week. They really want him in the lineup to get back on their winning ways. But remember, from a fantasy perspective, he has not topped 20 fantasy points in a game since Week 7, 4 straight games with less than 19 points. He gets the Bills this week. They allow the 6th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, less than 170 passing yards, 3 straight games as well, allowed by that Buffalo defense. I just steer clear of Aaron Rodgers, even if he returns to the lineup in week 13. My sleeper at quarterback, it's Cam Ward, the rookie out of Tennessee. I thought he played his best game as a pro last week. He looked really good, and that was against a good Seahawks defense. He had a season-high 26.5 fantasy points, threw for 256 yards. He had 2 total touchdowns without a turnover. I'm hoping this game gets him going a little bit. He can build on that momentum against a bad Jaguars pass defense. Jacksonville actually allows the 5th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, and they've allowed 270-plus passing yards 3 of 4 games. So I'm thinking Ward can build on that big game from this past week, and he can get it going again in week 13. All right, let's move on to the running backs. My starts. My first one is Travion Henderson of the New England Patriots. I know we were all worried about Ramondre Stevenson returning last week, wondering how that backfield split would work out, and it was Henderson playing 65% of the snaps. So that was a great sign. I know he lost out on some goal line work, but still, he was getting a ton of touches. He was the lead back in that offense once again, even with Stevenson around. And Stevenson really struggled again when he got those goal line opportunities. He did nothing. So maybe Henderson even gets more work going forward after that poor showing by Stevenson. I love Henderson this week against the New York Giants. They gave up 237 rushing yards last week, and they've allowed more than 150 rushing yards 4 or 5 games. I think the Patriots could do some real damage on the ground in this matchup. My next start at running back is Breece Hall of the New York Jets. He was really held in check rushing last week, but he still managed to score 14.9 fantasy points because he got it done in the passing game. That made up for his low rushing totals, and that's a positive for him. I think with Tyrod Taylor now in the lineup, he's going to have more success throwing the ball. That's good news for Hall. I think he could have more success as a receiver in the passing game because Taylor's going to have a better chance to make plays in the passing game than Justin Fields did. But we actually think that Hall can get it done as a rusher this week against the Falcons. They're much better against the pass than the run. The Falcons allow the 4th most fantasy points to running backs. They gave up more than 300 rushing yards in a game just 3 weeks back. I look for Hall to have a big game this week. My last start at running back is Kyren Williams of the Los Angeles Rams. He had his worst game of the season last week. Some of you might be down on him. He had just 5.8 fantasy points. That was against a really good Bucs rush defense, though. That Vita Vea is tough to run on. Remember, Williams had 3 straight games with 16-plus fantasy points before last week. I think he rebounds this week against Carolina. They allow the 7th most fantasy points of running backs on the season. They've allowed 120-plus rushing yards 3 straight and 4 of 5 games. My sits at running back. My first one's Javonte Williams of the Dallas Cowboys. He's really having a great first season with Dallas. He is 8th overall in fantasy running back scoring, but he's starting to cool just a little. He is just 28th in fantasy running back scoring his last 3 games. He's been held out of the end zone and is getting little less work in the passing game. So that has not been good news for his fantasy value. I think things could be tough again for him in week 13 against the Chiefs on Thanksgiving. Kansas City's pretty stout against the run. They allow the 4th fewest fantasy points to running backs. Chiefs have allowed less than 75 rushing yards 4 or 5 games. I think it could be tough sledding for Williams again in week 13. My next sit at running back is David Montgomery of the Detroit Lions. Montgomery is becoming a little hard to trust in his current role. He has played less than 40% of the snaps 2 straight games and 3 of 4. He's just 41st overall in fantasy running back scoring his last 3 games. I think you might just want to steer clear of him for now until he starts getting more consistent work. He's really a boomer bust play. You just don't know what's going to happen with him from week to week. He gets Green Bay this week. They've allowed fewer than 100 rushing yards 7 of 11 games as well. I think Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be the back that could make big plays against his Packers rush defense. I'm not sure Montgomery's a great fit to go against them. My last sit at running back is either of the Titans running backs, either Tony Pollard, Tajay Spears. I don't want any part of either of these guys. Spears, he has just 1 game all season with double-digit fantasy points. Pollard, he hasn't hit double-digit fantasy points since week 7. They get the Jags. They allow the 6th fewest fantasy points of running backs, less than 60 yards rushing yards allowed 2 straight games and 3 of 4. I think the Titans are going to have real problems running the ball with either of these guys. I don't want any part of them at this point of the season. My sleeper running back, it's Kenneth Gainwell of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's pretty much splitting the work right now at running back with Jaylen Warren. He has played more than 50% of the snaps, 3 straight games. Gainwell, if you can believe this, is 11th overall in fantasy running back scoring his last 3 games. He has 18 plus fantasy points, 2 straight games. He's producing big, mostly because of all his work in the passing game. I think he's going to keep it going this week against a Bills defense that has struggled to stop the running back. Buffalo allows the 3rd most fantasy points for running backs on the season. I think Gainwell is going to get a lot of dump offs in this game from Aaron Rodgers. He's going to be under pressure, and I think Gainwell is going to produce big, some good total yardage numbers for him, and he keeps it going again in week 13. We're moving on to the receiver position now. I'll give you 3 starts there, and it's going to start with Michael Wilson of the Arizona Cardinals. I already said I like Jacoby Brissett. I like Michael Wilson a lot too this week. So 2 Arizona players make my week 13 video here. And here's the big talk. They're even talking in Arizona that Michael Wilson's going to remain the number 1 receiver even when Marvin Harrison returns from his appendix issue. And he deserves it, Wilson, at this point. He's been absolutely fantastic. He is 3rd overall in receiver scoring his last 3 games. He has 25 receptions on 33 targets his last 3 games. He's a must start right now. I'm playing him against the Bucs in week 13, a team that allows the 10th most fantasy points to receivers. I think Wilson keeps it going, racks up the targets once again. My next start at receivers, Ladd McConkey of the Los Angeles Chargers. He had a poor showing his last time out, just 3 catches for 13 yards. He had 20-plus fantasy points 3 of his previous 5 games before that, though. He's really starting to come on after a slow start to the season. I like him to rebound this week against the Raiders. They're coming off a bye, the Chargers. They get the Raiders. They allow the 4th most fantasy points to receivers, and they've allowed 30 or more points overall 3 of 5 games. I think the Chargers offense could produce well in this matchup. My last start at receivers, Xavier Worthy of the Kansas City Chiefs. He's been kind of quiet lately, but he had 8 targets last week, his highest total since week 5. He has 4 games with double-digit fantasy points on the season. He gets the Cowboys on Thanksgiving. It's an improving defense, don't get me wrong, in Dallas, but still, they have struggles in the secondary, and I think this could be a high-scoring game on Thanksgiving. They allow the 2nd most fantasy points to receivers, plus Rashee Rice is a little banged up, so maybe Worthy gets a little more looks because of that as well. I like Worthy in week 13. My sits at receiver. My first one's Deebo Samuel of the Washington Commanders. Samuel is the top receiver for the Commanders, don't get me wrong, but he still isn't producing huge in that role. He has less than 50 receiving yards 3 of 4 games. Samuel can be up and down in the struggling offense. I think he's likely to have one of his down games this week against a very good Broncos secondary. They do a great job of shutting down the opposing number 1 receiver. Denver allows the fewest fantasy points to receivers on the season. I don't think Samuel's going to do much in this one. My next sit at receivers, Tyler Lockett of the Las Vegas Raiders. He's really kind of emerging as that number 1 receiver in the Raiders offense since Jacoby Myers was traded. He has 12 receptions his last 3 games, but I'm not getting too excited about him. I still think he plays in a pretty poor offense, and his numbers have not been very good most of the year. And I think he's going to struggle this week against Los Angeles, the Chargers. They allow the 5th fewest fantasy points to receivers. Chargers held the Raiders to just 150 passing yards in week 2. I don't see the passing game having much success for Las Vegas this week. My last sit at receiver, Jawan Jennings of the San Francisco 49ers. I still don't totally trust him despite his numbers being pretty good in recent weeks. He's found the end zone 3 of 4 games. That's really helped his fantasy numbers. Besides that, though, he has less than 50 yards 4 of 6 games. He's really a touchdown-dependent fantasy player in my eyes, and I don't think he scores this week against Cleveland. They have allowed 10 or fewer points 3 times this year. This defense is really good. I think it's going to be a low-scoring game, and I don't see Jennings scoring this week. I think they're going to have to rely on Christian McCaffrey to carry the offense. My sleeper at receiver, it's Pat Bryant of the Denver Broncos. He's been steadily getting more and more work as the season progresses. He had his best game as a pro his last time out, caught 5 passes for 82 yards on 6 targets. He has played more than 55% of the snaps 3 of 4 games. They're coming out of a bye. It seems like a lot of times these rookies get more involved in the offense after they come out of a bye. So hopefully that's the case this week for Bryant. Against a bad Commanders secondary, they allow the third most fantasy points to receivers. Bryant could be a sneaky play this week, in my opinion. The tight ends now. I'll give you 2 starts there. And my first one is Mark Andrews. He had just a catch last week on 3 targets, but he did have double-digit fantasy points 3 straight games before last week. He can still get it done and be a solid number 1 tight end for fantasy teams. I think he's a must-start this week against the Bengals. The Bengals have been absolutely torched by the opposing tight end all season long. They allow the most fantasy points to tight ends. They give up more than 20 fantasy points per game to the tight end. I think Mark Andrews has a big game this week. I'd give him my lineup if you have him. My next start at tight ends, Juwan Johnson of the New Orleans Saints. Really kind of been a surprise, but from a fantasy perspective, he's been really good. 4th in tight end scoring his last 3 games. He has double-digit fantasy points 5 straight games, so he's been really consistent at a tight end position that hasn't been consistent at all this year outside of the elite options. So Johnson's been one of those guys that's been putting up points. I think he does it again this week against Miami. They allow the 4th most fantasy points at tight ends. Johnson's a really good play in week 13. My sits at tight end. My first one's Colston Loveland of the Bears. He actually made my starts last week, and he made me look good because he scored 14.9 fantasy points. He had a good game. But he did have fewer than 50 yards in that game, though, and he has less than double-digit fantasy points 2 of 3 games. He's just not a sure thing just yet in this offense that likes to spread it around, and I'm not sure he finds much room to run against the Eagles. They do a great job of shutting down the tight end. They allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points to tight ends on the season. I think if you have better options than Loveland, I'd go with them this week. My last sit at tight ends, actually another guy that made my list last week and made me look good, and that was Hunter Henry. He had his best game of the season last week, took advantage of a great matchup against the Bengals. I mentioned how I love Andrews because he gets the Bengals. That's who Henry played last week when he had his best game of the season. But remember, before that game last week, he had fewer than double-digit fantasy points 7 straight games. He's still not a plug-and-play option by any means. Don't get fooled by that game last week. He gets the Giants this week. They've actually been pretty solid against the tight end all season, allow the 10th fewest fantasy points to tight ends. So if you have better options than Henry this week, I would definitely consider using them. My sleeper at tight end, it is TJ Hawkinson, who has actually been a huge bust this year. He has double-digit fantasy points, just 2 games, hasn't reached that mark since week 7, but he's capable of the big game. Don't get me wrong. I still think he has some potential, especially this week with Max Brosmer starting. Usually these rookie quarterbacks tend to like to dump the ball off to the tight end. So I think that could be an option this week for Hawkinson. I think he could get more targets than usual than he had with J.J. McCarthy throwing him passes. And it can't get much worse than J.J. McCarthy, though, right? I mean, I don't see how Brosmer can be a huge bummer play. A down play for the Vikings offense. It's at least a lateral move. Hopefully it's a positive move for the offense, which hasn't been very good throwing the ball at all. So I think Brosmer could dump the ball off to Hawkinson a lot this week against the Seahawks, a team that's allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to tight ends on the season. All right, those are my start, sits, and sleepers for week 13 of the fantasy football season. Again, hope you have a great Thanksgiving. Enjoy the day. Be safe. Have fun. Eat some food. Watch some football. This has been Jeff Paur for RealTime Fantasy Sports.